Hey guys, what's up? It's me again, and honestly, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't know what to talk about today. I was just chilling and scrolling through things, and then I thought about Star Wars, and it's been a while for Star Wars. So before we get into this conversation today, let me give you a little bit of background about my fandom of Star Wars. See, I did not start off as a fan of the movies. They barely blipped on my radar when I was growing up until 2003, when Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic came out, and I played the heck out of it. I love the story of Revan, Bastila, and the rest of the crew. I enjoyed Star Wars KOTOR 2. I haven't played that much of the Old Republic, the MMO, but I've tinkered with it a little bit, and I know that they cover some of it. But it was around 2006, 2007 that I gauntleted all of the Star Wars movies. That was before the new trilogy came out with Finn and Rey and the new gang, so to speak, Rose Tico and whatever Luke's grandson's name is, Ben Skywalker, Kylo Ren. Yeah, it's Kylo Ren. But needless to say, the new trilogy changed the course of Star Wars forever, and I would argue still to this point that it's not for the better. So let's talk about that today. What made Star Wars good? What was ultimately its downfall, and how it tried to rebound from the lack of success? And then what can they do to move forward? Because at this point, aside from The Mandalorian and some of the Clone Wars stuff that came out with Rebels and the revival of Season 6 with Ahsoka, not really much has come from it. And if you like the new stuff that's come out, then yeah, give me a shout. Hit me up in the comments. I'd love to hear your point of view. But I think there was a lot of different elements. For one, Rey is a Mary Sue character. She was perfect upon conception, so to speak. She didn't have much. Her growth or her switching character, the character progression, didn't really start until the third movie, and that's a huge problem. Like, when she's training, everything comes perfectly for her, and you can explain that away with the Force and how that gives the character's natural attributes, but it's not really going to be satisfactory with a brand new character that you don't realize is a Palpatine or a Skywalker, a self-adopted Skywalker, until the very end. So having the main character just perfecting her way through 2/3 of the trilogy, it's going to leave things unsatisfactory. There's no fall, there's no rise. She's just in a situation that she gets herself out of, and it doesn't leave any suspense, and it doesn't leave any sort of real emotional connection to the character, aside from people who've aligned themselves to that anyway. You can say it's anti-feminist, you can say it's whatever. I don't really care. There are plenty of female characters that I love who are fiercely independent, so it's nothing to do with that. In the way that, and part of this is going to be a new trilogy rant, because I believe despite how good The Mandalorian is, and The Mandalorian is really good, there's going to be some dumping on the new trilogy just because it set the pace for this new era of storytelling when it comes to Star Wars, so you can't really walk away from it. But let's rewind a little bit, go back to what Star Wars did well. So in the original trilogy, it is the rise of Luke Skywalker, growing from a young boy to a man who realizes his destiny, becomes a Jedi Master, deals with his own faults. He does have a little bit of Mike, Sam. I don't know what the male equivalent of Mary Sue is, but He did have a little bit of that, but it wasn't anywhere near to the severity of Rey. But they show his growth very well. He has lots of interesting character dynamics with Han Solo and Princess Leia, rest in peace. So there's a whole lot to work with as far as the character goes. And of course, it was fresh and they explored the galaxy, and you see a lot of Luke fighting with his own inner darkness, which is something that we really needed throughout Rey's story. Also, Leia and Han Solo, and Lando for that matter, they all have significant parts in the story. They're like not necessarily primary characters, but they're very good secondary and tertiary characters, as well as Palpatine. Palpatine's a good primary character. And the way, the prequels get dunked on a lot for being unsatisfactory compared to the original trilogy, but honestly, they hold up pretty well, and they hold the timeline well as far as how the story progresses from episode 1 to episode 6, because when I originally watched the series, I watched it from episode 1 through episode 6. I know a lot of people will say, hey, do 4, 5, and 6 first, but I wanted to see the story's chronological order instead of the published chronological order. So a lot of this, it feeds back into Anakin has assumed the role of Luke, where he is a promising Jedi who is dealing with his inner darkness. But instead of winning over his inner darkness like Luke, Anakin lost the fight against his inner darkness. So a lot of that culminated into what seemed like a pretty good formula, especially when The Force Awakens came, and you see Kylo Ren, and you see Finn showing some Force sensitivity, which they never revisit, ever. I swear, the writers completely wrote all of the characters into the dumpster. Kylo Ren's temper tantrums. And I know that it's supposed to be the burst of darkness that comes out from just pure anger, but the way that they wrote him showed it in a way that was more petulant. And that's no swipe at Adam Driver. I think he's a tremendous actor. I just think that they wrote him terribly. They wrote him into a corner, as they did for everybody else, in my opinion. But it just culminated in this wholly unsatisfying and ultimately angering issue with the story at the final trilogy that kind of slaps the face of the first 6 movies, in my opinion. But, after all that flopped, after the fans of Star Wars let Lucasfilm / Disney know how much they messed up, Disney tried to turn around and make new materials. They have The Mandalorian, The Bad Batch, what else? I know that they had a story involving the High Republic, which is supposed to be some sort of extension. And I don't know, like, The Mandalorian hits. It hits really well. I don't know how I feel about Kenobi. I don't know how I feel about Ahsoka. I did really like Rogue One. Rogue One was really good. But the conversation morphs into the future. So what does Star Wars do with their future? And obviously, they're not going to listen to me. I'm some small YouTuber. Just talking about stories and how I feel about them and whatnot. This isn't going to blip on the radar. But I wanted to have the conversation anyway. So, as time has gone on, it seems like they've tried to go against the trope duality of good versus evil. And by good versus evil, I mean Jedi versus Sith. What has encompassed the whole Star Wars saga from start to finish has been this idea of a crusade. There's been a positive force and there's been a negative force, and obviously there's those people who think that the Empire is right. There are those who think that the Resistance is correct. And it seems like Star Wars sometimes tries to get away from that dynamic, but it always comes back. You see it in The Mandalorian. Obviously, you see it in the one-offs for the Jedi singular stories. So, at some point, the war's got to end, right? There has to be some sort of new story that is not wholly Jedi versus Sith like it's always been, because I think to a degree part of the reason that we struggle moving forward is because Lucas and Disney have been stuck on this A versus B dynamic forever. Like, even the Witches of Dathomir, they're a Force offshoot of Jedi versus Sith. They're not necessarily either of those, even though they use the dark side of the Force. And I thought that hearing about their presence and about a story that was more centered around them was going to be more promising, and it didn't deliver quite like I would have liked, but I think that's a step in the right direction. So what about internal conflicts between the Witches of Dathomir? I know that the Jedi is kind of self-governing, but I remember in Knights of the Old Republic, there were gray Jedi, ones that didn't necessarily believe in the Jedi or the Sith. They just tried to do what was right, and they allowed their emotions to fuel them to a certain degree. I think also interesting stories can be built by reestablishing the Republic. We don't get into the actual places anymore. Did you notice that? Like the bars and the turf wars, the smaller stories. Maybe the problem is that Star Wars has just gotten too big. You know what I mean? And you see that a lot with high scale galactic animes. I've been trying to write a sci-fi story for years, and part of the reason that I struggle with it is because eventually it always gets too big for me. The story itself and the scope of the story itself. Like, how can you properly tell a story that spans an entire galaxy when there are so many amazing micro stories that can be happening in the midst of it? It's always going to be too big. So I guess a viable option for Star Wars would be getting back to the basics, making the story small again, making it simple, not necessarily having the family dynamics, but have it be in a small town or a small planet, small place, maybe 2 warring planets. Jedi, Sith, optional. Because there is more to this galaxy than just 2 forces fighting against each other, and I think Star Wars has lost that. They've lost that big time. And I have been away from Star Wars for quite a long time, because the new trilogy really just kind of ruined it for me. I've been exploring all sorts of different other sci-fi stories, and those sci-fi stories tend to capitalize on the little stories that can be found in the cracks. even though they have big over-encompassing stories like Star Wars does, like Fate of the Galaxy, Fate of the Universe, etc., etc. But I think that's it for me. I'm going to ask you guys, what do you think of the Star Wars franchise? Where do you think it's at? And if you don't like where it's going, where do you think it should? But I appreciate you guys watching. I'll catch you later.